Western countries turn off the money tap, freezing Russian bank assets and cutting off Putin's wealthy mates. We go live to Kyiv and speak to financial and political experts about what it all means, home and away. Back here, a record nobody wants, 12,011 community cases today. And the COVID response minister reckons the government never intended to exclude unvaccinated children from after-school sport.
RNZ News at 5 o'clock. Good afternoon. Kia ora tātou, ko Evie Ashton tēnei. The Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, has been rocked by explosions as residents woke to a second day of Russia's advance. Ukraine's authorities say it was their own forces downing enemy aircraft over the city. An overnight curfew is due to be lifted shortly, and many residents have taken refuge in metro stations, which are remaining open to serve as bomb shelters. In neighbouring Poland, reception centres have been set up along its border with Ukraine. The BBC's Mark Lowen reports.
For now, Poland says there's been only a modest uptick in crossings, although it has warned of the potential for the largest refugee crisis into Europe since 2015, when 1 million Syrians arrived. Poland has often been one of the most hardline anti-migrant voices in the EU, but it also knows all too tragically the cost of Russian occupation.
A bomb blast interrupted an interview with New Zealand's honorary consul to Ukraine today. Mark Wright was describing the tense atmosphere in Kyiv, saying the bombing on the outskirts of the city started at about 6 o'clock this morning.
You think things are quite normal on the street, and then suddenly you'll hear these deep boom, like one just went off. Oh God, one just went off then. That was much closer. And so, these are the things that kind of really set you on edge.
Mark Wright says the Russians are currently targeting military assets like air bases, but he expects they'll soon start attacking power and communication systems. A man from Kyiv living in New Zealand says his family are in great danger because of the Russian invasion. Igor Titov has been protesting today at the Russian embassy in Wellington.
Yesterday I was on the phone with my mom. I was preparing her to evacuate from her apartment. I was waking up my friends from the shelling.
About 80 other protesters were outside the Russian embassy this afternoon, with some throwing fake blood at its gates. The Prime Minister says any response from New Zealand on the ground in Ukraine would likely be humanitarian aid. New Zealand is calling on Russia to permanently withdraw from Ukraine. It now joined other Western countries in imposing travel and export bans against Russia. Jacinda Ardern was asked whether a military response was a possibility.
No country at the moment is engaging in that level of engagement. What I would say is that what we will keep open is the consideration of humanitarian assistance.
The Prime Minister says further measures are being considered. New Zealand has had its deadliest day of the COVID pandemic, with 5 more deaths and more than 12,000 new cases in the community. It takes the country's pandemic death toll to 61, with more than 230 people now in hospital. Samantha G reports.
New cases of COVID-19 in the community have more than quadrupled since Tuesday. And today's 12,011 cases bring the total number of active cases in the country to 39,500. The Ministry of Health says the increase is not unexpected, with the spread of the highly infectious Omicron variant and more than 8,000 positive results detected via rapid antigen tests. Those are now being used as the primary test across all testing centres. In the last 2 days, 5.2 million rapid antigen tests arrived in the country, with another 10 million due to arrive this weekend, bringing the total supply to 22 million.
A magnitude 6.2 earthquake has hit near the western coast of Indonesia's Sumatra Island, but there is no risk of a tsunami or immediate reports of major damage. The shallow quake, about 2 hours ago, was felt strongly in West Sumatra and in Riau province, and as far away as Singapore and Malaysia. Now to sport, and a maiden test century to South African opener Cyril Hervé has given the Proteas the upper hand on the opening day of the second cricket test against New Zealand in Christchurch. A short time ago, the tourists were 181 for 1, with Hervé unbeaten on 106. New Zealand lead the two-match series 1-0. The former All Blacks coach John Hart says Inga the winger was not only a special rugby player, but also a special person. Va'ainga Tuagamala, who played 16 tests for the All Blacks and 23 for Manu Samoa, has died at the age of 52, having suffered health issues in recent years. He was one of the first blockbusting wingers in New Zealand and world rugby.
You'll see a lot of comment about his infectious smile, because that was him. And he was just a lovely young man, and he gave to so many people, and he was particularly, committed to his community and to, his homeland in Samoa, and so he gave a lot of his time.
Meanwhile, Black Ferns captain and loose forward Les Elder has been named captain of the Chiefs Manawa side in the inaugural Super Rugby Aupiki competition. Wellington Phoenix midfielder Grace Wisniewski is returning home to New Zealand for mental health reasons and will miss the team's last 2 A-League women's games. And the Crusaders coach Scott Robertson is backing young first five Fergus Burke to step up in the absence of All Blacks first five Richie Mo'unga. That's the news.
Tomorrow morning, the 2 English cave divers who saved the lives of the trapped Thai football team. The co-founder of the Maori power retailer with wider ambitions than making money. An international conflict resolution expert. Need one of those. And Vincent O'Sullivan on his spooky new short story collection. Ko Kim Hilaho. Join me Saturday morning from 8 on RNZ National.
And we're funded by New Zealand On Air. You're on Checkpoint with Lisa Owen next, but first, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Saturday. For Northland to Taranaki, including Coromandel and Taumarunui, mainly fine, isolated showers for Northland and for Auckland and Coromandel Peninsula tomorrow. For the Bay of Plenty, Taupo and Taihape, fine, but some showers are developing tomorrow evening. Gisborne, Hawke's Bay and Wairarapa. Cloudy periods with isolated showers, some are possibly heavy about the ranges tomorrow. Whanganui to Wellington, mainly fine. Marlborough, Nelson and Bulla, fine today, but cloudy periods tomorrow. Isolated showers about the ranges of Marlborough and Nelson in the afternoons and evenings. For Westland and Fiordland, fine at first, cloud increasing tonight and rain developing about Fiordland, becoming fine tomorrow afternoon. Canterbury, Otago and Southland, mainly fine today. Scattered rain is developing about Stewart Island tonight and spreading northwards tomorrow morning. Rain is easing tomorrow afternoon and becoming fine south of Canterbury. And for Te Kohu, the Chatham Islands, cloudy periods and a few showers. The time is 7 minutes past 5. We'll have news headlines for you at 5:30.
Nā mihi iwi, tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haere mai ki Checkpoint I tēnei rā, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. Hundreds of people are dead or wounded as Russia continues its march into Ukraine. The Western world has returned fire, but its weapons of choice are words and more sanctions, including freezing the foreign assets of major Russian banks, blacklisting wealthy associates of President Putin, and banning exports that could benefit the invading forces. Russian troops have taken control of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant that sits on a strategic route between Belarus and Kyiv. They've also seized an airport in the capital and launched repeated missile attacks on a nearby military base. Meanwhile, cities have been gridlocked as residents try to flee over the border or take shelter in the underground train networks. US President Joe Biden says Putin's actions betray his sinister vision for the future of our world, and Russia's naked aggression cannot go unanswered. Nita Blake-Person reports.
Fleeing Ukraine by any means necessary, in shock, scared but resolute.
We are independent country, Ukraine, and we are totally not same as Russians. And we don't want to be a part of Russia or any other country.
Metro stations flooded with people desperate to get to safety.
And I cannot believe it's happening, really.
On Ukraine's northern and southern borders, Moscow's forces have been rolling in.
By choosing to pursue this entirely avoidable path, an unthinkable number of innocent lives could be lost because of Russia's decision. New Zealand calls on Russia to do what is right and immediately cease military operations in Ukraine and permanently withdraw to avoid a catastrophic and pointless loss of innocent life.
Jacinda Ardern says Putin's shown a disregard for diplomacy and has undermined decades of peace in the region. Some Russian officials have been banned from coming here. Exports to the military have been stopped. The Russian ambassador was called in by MFAT officials, but not expelled yet.
We want them all to be on the table. As this conflict escalates, we want the ability to continue to send a very strong message around our view on this invasion.
Former Prime Minister Helen Clark scathing of Putin's actions.
It's an abomination. Who in our lifetimes would have thought we would see a repeat of the kind of events that saw Hitler and his army march into Czechoslovakia in March 1939 or Poland in September 1939.
Putin, she says, is determined.
He is trying to rebuild what he sees as a past glory. This is not rational, and that's what makes it particularly dangerous.
In Ukraine, people have been lining up at petrol stations, cars snaking along roads out of the country, people pouring into train stations. The President, Volodymyr Zelensky, addressed the nation dressed for battle in military uniform.
What do we hear today? It's not just rocket explosions, fighting, the roar of aircraft. It is the sound of a new iron curtain lowering and closing Russia away from the civilized world. Our national task is for that curtain not to fall on Ukrainian territory, but on the homes of Russians.
A full military is being assembled. Ukrainians are ready to fight. There have been lengthy queues at enlistment points.
It's only one way to serve our country, our children, our mothers, and defend our country from Russian occupation, and we will fight all day.
Putin's aggression is dividing opinion in Russia. Anti-war protests have been taking place in major cities. Western allies have been united in condemning Moscow's actions.
Now, the entire world sees clearly what Putin and his Kremlin allies are really all about.
A brutal assault without provocation, according to Joe Biden.
This was never about a genuine security concerns on their part. It was always about naked aggression, about Putin's desire for empire by any means necessary, by bullying Russia's neighbors through coercion and corruption, by changing borders by force, and ultimately by choosing a war without a cause.
A similar message from Boris Johnson.
For this, Putin will stand condemned in the eyes of the world and of history. He will never be able to cleanse the blood of Ukraine from his hands.
But despite international condemnation, Putin is on a mission.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been met with despair and anger in New Zealand. Our reporter Tom Kitchen and cameraman Samuel Rillstone have the story.
Fake blood plastered over the gate and driveway into the Russian embassy in Wellington. Shouts of blood on your hands, hands off Ukraine. Tanya has family in Ukraine and doesn't know if her nephew is still alive.
I spoke this morning. He sent me a message saying they're not evacuated, they're not allowed to leave the building. They can see fighting on the streets from the apartment where he is, and it's very scary.
Sanctions have come thick and fast from Western nations, but it's cold comfort for people here.
Sanctions not going to save our lives. They're not. It's too late for sanctions. I want to see my mum again. I want to see my brother.
Lana says she's afraid for her community.
I can't tell you how scared we are. My mum almost ended up in the hospital this morning. She's at home. She couldn't even come here. I didn't sleep last night. She didn't sleep last night. I don't think anyone in Ukrainian community had 1 hour of sleep last night. We are constantly in contact with our relatives and friends back there.
Igor has been speaking to his family back in Kyiv.
Yesterday I was on the phone with my mom. I was preparing her to evacuate from her own apartment. I was waking up my friends from the shelling.
Titiana and Natalia wrapped the colours of the Ukraine flag around a brick post by the entrance of the embassy.
Why we did it here near Russian embassy? Because Russia everywhere in our territory, when they come, just like for first seconds what they're doing, they everywhere put their flags, they up their flags.
Natalia thinks it will send a strong message.
I want them to see our colors when they wake up in the morning and go to dinner in the evening. I want to see those colors when they leave for shopping and coming back.
Elsewhere in New Zealand, Ukrainians have been horrified at what's happening. Inga Tokarenko has spent all morning on the phone to her family who are sheltering underground.
So they're waiting for people to arrive and keep their kids safe. But there are a lot of people stuck in traffic because all major airports were bombed.
Northland woman Olia Topihina says what's happening in her home country feels surreal. Her parents live in the west of the country and have chosen to stay and fight, offering up their home to those who have been displaced.
My biggest desire is no World War III. I don't know what sick thoughts Putin has in his mind, but he will not stop at Ukraine when he gets it.
She says people in New Zealand and around the world need to protest against Russia's attacks, saying she doesn't believe they will stop with Ukraine.
Yesterday they woke up to a bombing because of the hit of the wave from the bomb. It shook their windows, so they woke up. I called them this morning and they were already heading off to the underground facility. They can feel the shock waves.
Protests condemning Russia's actions will continue over the weekend across the country.
It is 5:15 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Kia ora rawatu mo te whakarongo mai. Haere aki nei, coming up, a record nobody wants, more than 12,000 new community COVID cases today. Let's go now live to Kyiv and CNN correspondent Tim Lister. Tim, can you just tell us what the last 24 hours have been like in the city?
Lisa, yeah, sort of surreal to be honest with you, because on the surface, life continues. People trying to get their daily provisions, trying to get money from cash machines and so forth, but you just get this sense of a collective trauma here as they recognize they really have a very different future ahead of them. This was a country which was, especially amongst the younger people, really looking forward to a more Western democratic way of life, and suddenly they feel they're being dragged back into an alternative reality, one that reminds them, or their parents at any rate, of the Soviet days. So it's a strange situation. It has been, I have to say, quieter overnight. I'm looking out over the skyline right now. It's just dawn here. We've had a couple of explosions, and we know 3 people were injured in an apartment block not far from the middle of Kyiv, but it's been much quieter than last night.
Tim, you mentioned the apartment block. What targets does it appear that Russia is hitting?
On the whole, Russia has been very aware of hitting military targets, and in fact, as I speak to you now, 2 pretty substantial explosions, make that 3, on the horizon out to the west. As I say, Russians have really focused on military infrastructure, on security installations and so forth. But there is a feeling that the next phase, this is definitely what the Ukrainians feel, the next phase for them will be hitting political apex of the Ukrainian state, if you will. They really are exerting much more military control, especially around Kyiv. We know that they're literally 20 miles away at an airbase, which they seized yesterday. And we can feel that basically the Ukrainians are very much on the back foot at the moment. But as to the next phase, when it starts, what it is like, that's still something of an open question, Lisa.
You say some locals are going about their daily business, but are some trying to leave, and what does that look like?
Yeah, definitely. Yesterday in particular, in the morning, after the first barrage of missile attacks overnight, particularly around the airport area, the roads west out towards Poland and Slovakia were absolutely chock-a-block, really, really crowded. And long queues at gas stations. And so, yeah, people did try to get out. You definitely sense that the place is quieter. But those who've left behind are just concentrating now on getting through the day, making sure that they have enough food, that if they do have to stay at home for a prolonged period of time, they can survive. So far, communications, internet, phones have survived pretty well. But no, you get a sense that people are just trying to make their lives sustainable without really beginning to comprehend what's happening to them.
What can you tell us about the whereabouts of the Ukraine president?
President Zelensky says that he is still very much in the government quarter, as it's called, in a secure place. He's not disclosed where his family is, but he's described himself as the number one target for the Russians. And he's probably right about that. And there's no sign at the moment that he plans to give up or look for safe passage out of the country. He's issued a number of very defiant video messages over the last couple of days, but in the most recent one, which was after midnight last night, there was clear bitterness in his tone about NATO and about how he felt let down, that they'd simply not been ready to accept Ukraine into the Western community, and now Ukraine was paying the price for that. There was a real sense of being let down. He looked very haggard. He looked very despondent, to be honest with you, but there was still an underlying defiance in his tone.
Tim, when you say that Russian military forces are about 20 miles away, 36 k's, is there a sense that, of when they may arrive in the centre of Kyiv and what their intentions will be?
In a word, no. We don't know quite how the Russians see the next phase of this playing out, whether they plan to install a pro-Russian government here and not actually occupy cities. There's no sign so far that they've tried to occupy any town of any size in Ukraine. They're on the move, very much so. We feel that from the satellite imagery we've seen and from the videos we've collected, there's a very substantial Russian force coming down from the north, from Belarus, when they entered through that border yesterday. We know there's another very substantial force of Russians coming from the northeast, and they've passed through Sumy, which is one of the bigger towns in the Ukrainian northeast. But what they do when they get to Kyiv, I think, is something of an open question. It's a very big city. It would be very difficult to occupy it successfully. And they may prefer to sit on the outside and, if you will, and it sounds terrible, decapitate the current government and install a pro-Russian government. That's, after all, what UK intelligence last month suggested would happen if the invasion was to go forward.
Tim, we thank you very much for your time. That is CNN correspondent Tim Lister speaking to us live there from Kyiv. The future of Europe is at stake and lessons of the past need to be recalled. That's the view of Ukraine's acting ambassador for New Zealand, who has called on international communities to rally behind Ukrainians under siege. Ambassador of Ukraine to Singapore and New Zealand, Katerina Zelenko, says Russia has turned peaceful cities into war zones.
The Russian troops fired at our positions 393 times, including 32 civilian objects, destroyed 6 control posts, attacked Serpent Island in the Black Sea, seized the Chernobyl nuclear power station, and a part of southern Kherson region, including the North Crimean Canal.
Zelenko says the enemy strikes were not only on military targets but civilians as well, and Ukraine is fighting back.
The Russian troops are suffering losses: aircrafts, helicopters, tanks, trucks, personnel. Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Lieutenant General Valery Zaluzhny, said that the estimated losses of the enemy at the end of the first day of invasion are as follows: more than 30 tanks, up to 130 armored combat vehicles, 7 airplanes, and 6 helicopters. The Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine gave orders to inflict the maximum losses to the aggressor. Thousands of Ukrainian citizens have already joined the ranks of territorial defense. More are to come in the next days.
Zelenko has called on the entire international community to rally behind Ukraine, or they too will suffer.
History repeats itself. That is what we know from the school books. We cannot let this happen again. Lessons of the past need to be recalled. If the world doesn't stop Russian aggression, the world will suffer. Since yesterday, the websites of the governmental institutions of Ukraine suffer from cyber attacks. In response, Ukraine has activated its right for self-defense according to the Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. We will defend our soil.
And that was Ambassador of Ukraine to Singapore and New Zealand, Katerina Zelenko. It is 24 minutes past 5. Kia amo tonu mai. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. The country is ending the week with more record numbers from the COVID outbreak. New community cases announced today were almost double yesterday's figure at just over a whopping 12,000. And the Health Ministry also announced 5 deaths, the most reported in a single day since the pandemic began. More than 27,000 vaccinations were given yesterday, the vast majority booster shots. Amid all of this, the COVID Response Minister, Chris Hipkins, visited one of the first schools in the Wellington region to deal directly with the virus. Here's our education correspondent, John Gerritsen.
Chris Hipkins' audience at Mana College in Porirua included the very first Wellington students to isolate because a classmate had COVID. He told them the virus is only going to keep spreading.
We're now up to 1 in 5 schools have COVID-19 cases in them, and that's going to just continue to increase from here. We expect in the next few weeks that just about every school, every early childhood service potentially is going to end up coming into contact with COVID-19 as it spreads more rapidly throughout the community. That is now going to happen.
But he insists schools and the government are well prepared.
92% of our secondary school students have been fully vaccinated. We've got about 42 million masks either on order or already out there distributed to schools. We've got several thousand, about 5,000 air cleaners, which will sit in the corner of the room and they will help to clean the air when you can't have all the doors and windows open.
The Minister suggested 2 big deliveries of rapid antigen tests in the next 2 weeks might allow the government to give schools easier access. Currently, the tests are a last resort if schools can't find enough teachers to safely supervise children who can't be at home, such as the children of essential workers. Steve Hargraves from the Auckland Secondary Principals Association says that could make a big difference as the pandemic bites.
That'll help keep schools open. Schools are rostering year levels home and children are having to learn remotely because so many staff are tied up as contacts, close contacts. Family members have tested positive, but they're still well. They've been able to isolate successfully at home. And if we can keep those teachers in school through the use of rapid antigen tests, that'll be good for our children.
Chris Hipkins also promised to clarify the rules around unvaccinated children's participation in after-school sport and cultural activities. The Education Ministry's website says extracurricular events like team trainings at schools must be limited to 25 people if any are unvaccinated. But Chris Hipkins says that was not the government's intention.
Some schools are interpreting something like a kapa haka rehearsal after school hours or a sports practice after school hours as being included in the guidance. We'd never intended for that to be the case, so we're clarifying that. So to make it clear that if you're participating in a school organised activity, that includes sports, kapa haka, those other cultural events, the vaccine requirement will not apply.
The Ministry's office and the Ministry were unable to confirm details, and Steve Hargraves says that's a shame because he has unvaccinated students ready to play sport tomorrow.
It's really sad because we don't want to exclude any children from these great extracurricular opportunities, but we've been following the guidelines around events and gatherings and those size limits, and of course College Sport Auckland has its rule around needing to be vaccinated to comply with those rules. And that's blocked a few kids from playing. And the sooner we can get this tidied up, the better.
Mike Summerall from School Sport New Zealand says the announcement caught him by surprise, but it looks good.
We welcome the news. It's been a divisive and difficult time for sport and for schools in terms of inter-school activity. But the announcement this morning means more kids are going to have access to sport where over the last few months they haven't. So that's a real positive.
He's hoping the rule change allows unvaccinated children to play in inter-school matches, but says big school tournaments are still off the calendar because they involve more than 100 people.
Homai o whakaaro, we would love your feedback. Nō reira anei na kaupapa mo te hōtaka nei. On the subject of children and COVID vaccinations, do you reckon that kids playing for sports teams, going to kapahaka events, that they should be allowed to participate whether or not they are vaccinated, as long as the event is school organised activity, even if it's outside school hours? Let us know your thoughts. Text me 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. The crisis in Ukraine has sent oil prices skyward, topping $105 a barrel. But the government is reassuring New Zealanders the supply here is in good shape because it comes from the Middle East. But in a global market, the rising cost of oil has repercussions for huge swathes of society. Sam Ollie explains.
Petrol prices have been climbing for weeks, averaging more than $2.50 a litre last month, driven up in part by the Russia-Ukraine tensions. The invasion has caused another, much faster hike.
There was around just under 10% increase in crude prices over the last 48 hours, so you could expect that to be reflected in a circa 10 cent a litre price increase at the pumps in the next week or 2 weeks.
Waitomo Group General Manager Jimmy Ormsby says the global oil price will keep rising as the violence worsens, so he's stocked up.
Fuel you buy today is going to potentially be cheaper than what it's going to be tomorrow, so we've been trying to keep all our tanks full.
Russia is the second largest exporter of crude oil in the world, meaning the conflict in Eastern Europe will hit the wallets of drivers in Aotearoa, thousands of kilometres away. With the military operation escalating, it's likely exports will dwindle, putting the squeeze on global oil supply and pushing prices up. Massey University energy expert emeritus Professor Ralph Sims explains it in New Zealand dollars.
For every dollar price rise of the world oil price, in rough terms, then there's an extra cent per litre on the purchase price at the pumps.
Drivers unimpressed.
I'm on the pension. Of course it'll have an impact. It'll be pretty bad, actually.
They're definitely going up under that $3 mark. Depends where you go.
Puts us off wanting to go anywhere in the motorhome, because you're just going through the roof now.
2 years ago, 20% of New Zealand's crude oil came from Russia, but the country has since stopped purchasing Russian oil products. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern today cited the likes of Z Energy, which hasn't imported Russian fuel for 6 months.
Our fuel supply tends to be dominated by Middle East and Asia.
The government says New Zealand's fuel security is assured, but it is a whole different story in Ukraine. Demand for petrol is high as many fill their tanks to flee constant bombing, like this man, Andre, who spoke to the BBC.
I heard it clearly. The earth was really shaking. So we got up and now we are waiting for fuel. We will buy some so we can be mobile in case all communications are cut. We have to prepare. What else can we do?
Europe may buy more oil from the US and Middle East if Russian supply disappears.
And that was Sam Ollie reporting. Kia ora e te iwi e haere nei I a Checkpoint. Is it time to close the gap between COVID jabs for children? New Plymouth retailers say their CBD is a ghost town as Omicron marches on, and as New Zealand whipped out a wet bus ticket to whack Russia on the wrist. Homai o whakaaro, we would love your feedback on anything you've heard on the programme this evening. Text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or you can send us an email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. It is time now for the headlines. Ko iwi anō tēnei.
The Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, has been rocked by explosions as residents woke to a second day of Russia's advance. Ukraine's authorities say it was their own forces downing enemy aircraft over the city. Many residents have taken refuge in metro stations, which are remaining open to serve as bomb shelters. CNN correspondent Tim Lister is in Kyiv, and he told Checkpoint that people in Ukraine feel they're being dragged back to the Soviet days. They fear the next phase of the attack will hit the country's leadership. He says roads out of the city are chock-a-block as people try to flee the invasion. The UN Refugee Agency is warning of a potential refugee crisis. And Russian authorities have broken up widespread protests across their country opposing the invasion of Ukraine. New Zealand is calling on Russia to permanently withdraw from Ukraine. It's joined other Western countries in imposing travel and export bans against Russia. There are 12,000 new cases of COVID-19 in the community and 5 deaths have been reported on the deadliest day of the pandemic so far. More than 230 people are in hospital. The High Court has quashed the COVID-19 vaccine mandate for the police and defence force after 3 unvaccinated staff sought a judicial review. A ship with 18 people on board has crossed Cook Strait to join the anti-mandate protest at Parliament, including a couple who intend to get married there. Police are warning people not to join the protest this weekend. They say the crowd is getting smaller. There are about 300 vehicles in the cordoned area, compared with 800 or so a week ago. A magnitude 6.2 earthquake has hit near the western coast of Indonesia's Sumatra Island, but there is no risk of a tsunami or immediate reports of major damage. And the Queen has postponed engagements for the second time in a week following her positive COVID test. Buckingham Palace says the monarch, who tested positive for the virus on Sunday, will continue with light duties. Those are the headlines. Our next full bulletin is at 6 o'clock.
Kia ora rā iho, no mai hoki mai. This is Checkpoint, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. Some of you getting in touch on the issue of Ukraine and Russia. Mike says, I don't understand why we are still exporting food products to Russia. The idea that it won't end up going to their massive military is absurd. It's truly disgusting and pathetic. And another listener says New Zealand needs to expel any Russian diplomats. It is time for business news right now. Ko taku hoa e nai ko Nona Peltier, and we're going to stick with the Russian theme. Nona, 2 of the country's biggest investment managers, both state-owned, are invested in Russian companies. What are the details?
Yeah, it's the super fund. That's the fund that manages our pension fund. And they're invested some 25 million in Russian companies as well as bond investments. But they don't believe that any of these particular investments will be subject to sanctions, that they have passed their responsible investment policies, and that if there was an issue, those particular companies would be deleted from their portfolio. And that's one of the reasons why, is because they have their index that they're invested in, which is the MSCI, is operated by a U.S.-based company, and they would be required to respond to any U.S. government sanctions and remove any particular companies off their indices. And that's really the same story for the NZX, which is also exposed to Russian investments through one of its exchange-traded funds. And the ACC also has 52 million invested in Russian equities and corporate bonds. But they say also that those funds, those investments, are subject to their ethical investment funds. So if there is anything there that has to be addressed, you can be sure it will be.
And the global markets are closely monitoring oil prices, which have spiked following the Russian invasion into Ukraine. What is happening to prices?
Well, overnight, they went up as high as $105 a barrel. That's Brent crude. That's very high. And we haven't seen those levels, I guess, 7 years. But they're still creeping up. And today, there was a bit of a pullback overnight, say, to under $100. But look, through the day, we've been moving up, and we're up nearly 3% in late trading to $102 a barrel. Now, over the last little while, we've heard from experts saying that the price could go to about 110 and then kind of button back a bit as the market adjusts to it, and that they start to see the physical supply of oil flowing. And that's because a lot of oil does come through other sources, not just Russia. Although Russia is a major supplier, it's not going to be without some hurt at the pumps, as we've heard earlier in that piece. But nevertheless, the oil supply is expected to be maintained, and that's because the U.S. government is taking steps to ensure that there is a supply by easing that supply and to make sure that there's no crunch. But look, even China is saying this is a global issue, that all countries have to work together to address energy issues. So it's not by any means over. We're going to see a lot of volatility there. The Reserve Bank governor today spoke about oil prices and said that it's one of the biggest contributors to inflation because of the flow-on effects. So, yeah, it's been a tough week for sure for the markets, and I don't think it's going to get any easier anytime soon.
So, speaking of the markets, Nona, what other numbers do you bring us?
Well, we had a big bounce back after yesterday's 3.3% fall to the NZX Top 50 Index. We ended up 1.6%. That was a 191-point gain to 11,923. And that's in line with what we saw elsewhere in the markets, global markets. The New Zealand dollar is also steady after taking a bit of a drop overnight at 67 US cents, 93.3 Australian, and 49.9 pence.
Thanks, Nona. Ka kite. Nona Peltier there with Business News. US President Joe Biden's name-checked New Zealand as one of the countries sanctioning Russia. Some have pulled out the big financial guns, freezing the offshore assets of Russian banks, cutting access to international markets and investors, banning their planes from landing, and blacklisting wealthy individuals in Putin's inner circle. New Zealand's introducing a travel ban on Russian government officials, suspended bilateral talks, and is blocking exports that aid the invading forces. But is that enough? Joining us now is Victoria University Professor of Strategic Studies, Robert Asen. Kia ora, Robert.
Good afternoon, Lisa.
Has New Zealand kind of got out the equivalent of the wet bus ticket to deal with this?
I think New Zealand is trying to do all it can to demonstrate it's on the same page with a number of those Western partners, but it's doing that with one hand tied behind its back because of the absence of the autonomous sanctions legislation, which the Prime Minister now seems more open to, and Nanaia Mahuta yesterday morning as well on Morning Report indicated some openness to as well.
So, for people who are not up with this is the law that would allow us to, well, basically march to the beat of our own drum when it comes to sanctions, when we normally follow the course of examples set by the UN.
Yeah, so, you can imagine a situation where if someone wanted to, and there will be, an attempt to get a UN Security Council statement, a declaration actually criticising Russia, condemning Russia, and also opposing new sanctions internationally. But of course, Russia will veto that, and I would expect China would do that as well. So that's implausible in this situation. There are some things that New Zealand can do, and you have mentioned some of those. So those travel restrictions on officials. It's mainly official to official contact that New Zealand can do. So you see that in the in the reduction in some of the diplomatic contact, and you've also seen that in terms of, there are a series of strategic goods that New Zealand has as lists, including things that result from international agreements, and so that's where those export controls on military type items go for. But a number of the things that the Western partners are doing, and including, for example, including targeting individuals, targeting some of those oligarchs, trying to put pressure on those very wealthy individuals with close connections to Putin, those sorts of things, targeting some of the commercial space. That's much harder without an autonomous sanctions regime, and until now, New Zealand's not had that, and still doesn't have that unless it does address that legislative gap.
Okay, so overseas countries, a number of them have done things like block these major Russian banks and, in essence, freeze their offshore assets. But there were other things they could do as well. This banking facility, SWIFT, which is responsible for a lot of transactions, they've chosen not to touch that. So I suppose the question is, does the West want to hurt Russia as long as it doesn't hurt itself in the process?
I think the West does want to punish Russia and wants to do with sanctions what it can to make things difficult, but of course this takes time. I do think that the SWIFT, Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications, is some see as the sort of the ultimate option there in terms of, and I think there are, within the EU, for example, there are some members of the EU who aren't sure about that, they want perhaps to leave that last bit of leverage in their pocket. And what Mr. Biden has said is that the sanctions that he's announced, and the sanctions also, there's a series of partners, the UK, US, UK, Canada, Japan, I think Australia, and quite possibly EU as well, are also changing their export control arrangements so that US components, high technology components, things like the semiconductors and lasers and things, if those are a part of a good, those cannot be exported even from those countries. Now, can New Zealand look at that, for example? But yeah, there are. I think what's also happening, hearing Mr. Biden this morning, is that he is talking up sanctions at times. And so while he's not saying that these are going to deter Mr. Putin, and that obviously they haven't, or that they are definitely going to change the course of action, the way the US is talking about it is that if Russia does this militarily, we will do this with sanctions. But it's kind of an unfair, balance, if you like. And so there's only so far you can go with sanctions. But again, sanctions are those things in between war and talk that governments often resort to. And it's around sanctions that this primary group of countries are showing unity. And what New Zealand's trying to say is that we're united with those countries, even though there are some things we aren't doing, quite a few things. And then, but there's also the issue of the condemnation, the sort of Jacinda Ardern this morning talked about or this afternoon talked about the unity of voice. So that kind of that moral suasion, but you can only go so far with that as well.
So President Biden claims that Putin has larger ambitions than Ukraine, that he wants, in fact, to re-establish the former Soviet Union. That is what this is about. Those are the words of President Biden. Do you agree with that?
I'm not sure how far Putin's ambitions go. Clearly, we're seeing it very, very clearly with Ukraine. And I mean, Ukraine, the two largest countries in Europe are Russia and Ukraine. And Ukraine does have a particular place in Russia's view of its near abroad and areas where Russian elites want to have influence. And so, if you were, in a sense for Putin, having Ukraine subordinate to his wishes is central to his thinking about Russian power. There's no doubt about that. And then there's also the issue of the access to warm water ports. And so one of the things that the Russian forces appear to be doing now is setting up the possibility of some sort of blockade further along from the control they've had over Crimea. And so in that sense, Crimea is in a particularly significant place. That doesn't mean, though, but even if Mr. Putin doesn't want to invade, say Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia, the three Baltic republics that used to be part of the Soviet Union, that doesn't mean they've got no reason to be worried about, because, of course, two of them are neighbours of Belarus, from which these forces moved. They are concerned about their own security. There are also countries, former parts of the Eastern Bloc, countries like Poland, who are very worried about their security. And so in that sense, this is creating real problems for them, a real issue for NATO, regardless of whether Mr. Putin wants to go beyond Ukraine. But the fact that he is using force to change international boundaries, or that's what he's intending to do, that is a real danger sign for European security. And it's very hard to get inside his mind and know how far his ambitions go. But also, the other thing is that Russia doesn't have, there are limits to Russia's power, and we may see some of those limits even in Ukraine.
Thank you for joining us this evening. That is Robert Asen, Professor of Strategic Studies from Victoria University. It is 14 minutes to 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. And Muriaki na pita pita kōrero after the news at 6, the impact on oil prices from the Russian invasion. While Omicron infections are surging, most 5 to 11-year-olds can't be fully vaccinated until at least the middle of next month. The government says it's considered shortening the 8-week gap between first and second Pfizer jabs, but decided against it. But with COVID infection rates in the age group accounting for 14% of new cases in the last 7 days, experts are divided on whether it's time to speed up childhood vaccinations. Jill Bonnet reports.
The rollout of the paediatric COVID vaccinations began only last month, and an 8-week gap is seen as the sweet spot in getting an immune response. That means March the 14th is the earliest 5 to 11-year-olds can have their second dose, unless they're immunocompromised. But with almost 2,500 active COVID cases aged under 9 and more than half of Auckland schools reporting cases, does 8 weeks still make sense? A COVID data analyst, Dr Rawiri Taunui, says New Zealand has been slow and conservative in setting its timeframes, and it's time for a rethink.
I don't think the Ministry of Health is treating that issue with enough urgency. The facts are that Pfizer recommends a 3-week wait period for the tamariki vaccination. The FDA in the United States does that, and so does Health Canada. Health Canada has made it as an option, so with parental consent, children can be vaccinated at 3 weeks.
He says he brought it up with Maori cabinet ministers last week. With the move to phase 3 restrictions and case numbers heading for 10,000 a day, he says tamariki Māori in particular are at risk of being dangerously exposed to the virus. The Director General of Health, Dr Ashley Bloomfield, says they've already asked the Government Advisory Group whether a shorter gap would be better.
They've provided advice now that we should maintain the 8-week gap. Children, because of their much more attuned immune systems, have a much starker response to that first dose, and then it's also a bigger gap is better for long-term immunity and for reducing the likelihood of some of those rare side effects.
The Director of the Immunisation Advisory Centre at the University of Auckland, Professor Nikki Turner, echoes that.
Children have a very vigorous immune response, so they respond really well to vaccines. They get a good, vigorous response. It lasts longer. It's more durable. And also, the second point is that children are at much lower risk of severe COVID disease.
More than 6,000 COVID cases have been reported in under 12 since August. 76 children have been hospitalised and 1 boy died. Rates of first vaccine doses so far vary significantly across the country. More than 60% are partially vaccinated in Auckland DHB and Capital and Coast, compared to 28% in Northland, and only 1 in 5 tamariki Māori in that region have had their first dose. 6 weeks apart was the original spacing for adult vaccine doses until it was changed during last year's Delta lockdown to 3 weeks. The director of Wellington's Mulligan Institute of Medical Research, immunologist Professor Graham LeGros, says the 8-week strategy has benefits for children's long-term immunity shield.
You don't want a half-done vaccination program and then be quite vulnerable for the next few months because you haven't made a really good immune response.
He says a shorter gap could leave children more vulnerable as the virus continues to circulate in the months ahead.
New Plymouth retailers say the CBD resembles a ghost town as the Omicron wave makes its presence felt around the country. Trade is down as much as 40% despite the red light setting allowing most activity outside of large events. Our New Plymouth reporter Robin Martin took his camera and went out to speak to locals.
It's lunchtime on a beautiful late summer's day in New Plymouth, and normally the city centre would be humming with people. But the streets are quiet and everywhere you look, cafe tables stand empty. Jennifer Hilford is co-owner of Bateman's Bakery on Devon Street. She says the town is dead.
Pretty quiet. It's a bit of a ghost town. A lot of the time we've got a lot of people walking around first thing in the morning, and lately just nothing. People can park right outside the shop, which is kind of nice but a bit spooky because otherwise people always just walk in to see us because there's normally no car parks. The whole warehouse car park's empty.
Miss Hilford says her turnover is down 40%. But other businesses have it even worse. Over at Chaos Cafe, there's only a handful of customers during what should be the lunchtime rush. Owner Kerry Vossler says people are staying away from the city centre.
We've still got our core group of regular customers, but we're not seeing, if I say, the transient group that would normally travel through on a regular basis. So, yeah, it's gone very quiet.
Ms Vossler says her turnover has also tanked and it can't go on this way.
It's not sustainable at all. I've always run with credit in the bank, but that can't last forever. Obviously, that's disappearing rapidly.
And it's not just hospitality that's suffering. The owner of Broham Barbers and Gifts, Wendy Ashton, says business is down about a third.
I think people are scared, you know, they are genuinely scared. Because of what is being reported through the media, you know, and I don't blame the media for that. They're just trying to cover these stories, especially the elderly. The elderly are really struggling. Just the lack of communication between them being locked down or feeling like they need to be locked down has a huge impact on how they're feeling mentally.
Arun Chandrai is the Chief Executive of the Taranaki Chamber of Commerce. He says it's possible 5 to 10% of businesses around the region won't survive the Omicron outbreak.
People are scared, they're worried, they want to protect themselves, they want to protect the vulnerable sections of society and their whānau. It's not helping businesses. Businesses are really suffering and they're getting crippled with the lack of cash flow, with other problems that they've got from before.
But there were mixed feelings from those people actually out and about.
Yeah, I don't really mind, to be honest. I'm just, going out and about, doing whatever I need to. Yeah, not really a problem for me.
Likewise here.
Not safe. No, this is the first time I've come into town for a long time.
We don't go near big crowds and we don't go off to places where there's lots and lots of people, but we go visiting our friends and...
I don't really mind it, to be honest. I think because I work in a supermarket, I'm around people anyways.
The Chamber of Commerce says it's working with the District Council on a buy local campaign, encouraging online shopping and the uptake of vouchers for future use.
And if you're listening to Robin's piece on radio, do check out the video. We'll put it on our webpage. A lot of you getting in touch about the issue of whether unvaccinated kids should be allowed to play school sport or participate in school clubs and events, if you like. And very much you're in favour of everyone being allowed to participate. Yes, leave the kids alone. Let them play sports regardless. Let the children play. How absolutely heartless not to. This, on the other hand, my kids will not be playing sports with unvaccinated kids. It's disgraceful. Vaxxed only. No child should be excluded from participating in sport due to vaccination status. They are the demographic least impacted, so it's not a risk-based decision to keep the vaccine free out. Thanks for your feedback. Do keep it coming. The population of little blue penguins along Mount Mauganui's coastline is declining, with numbers worse now than after the Rena oil spill. Conservationists are urging more action to prevent the situation becoming dire. Leah Tibbett with this report.
The Western Bay Wildlife Trust says the La Nina weather system is causing a decline in the penguin colony. The chair of the trust, Melissa McCluskey, says the weather has impacted penguin food supplies and chicks are left alone longer as their parents hunt for food.
There's been lots of starving fledglings wash ashore and our adults have been underweight during the breeding season as well, so they find it hard to feed their chicks themselves, and the chicks are definitely much lighter than in a good food year.
Miss McCluskey says it's worse now than after the Rena oil spill a decade ago.
We see less birds coming ashore compared to when we used to do the Rena monitoring. We also have a lot of burrows that used to be active breeding burrows that are no longer used, and now they are filled with pigeons.
The Tauranga City Council has installed fencing around breeding areas along Motariki Island. The council's Josh Cole says it's made a big difference.
It's worked out really well. The forest regeneration from not having people walking on it, and I'm sure like Western Bay Wildlife Trust has said they've now had burrows that hadn't been used in a few years being reused and re-engaged by penguins, so they're definitely responded to that fence there.
He says now it's time to change the behaviour of the locals and their pets.
So we are dealing with just that ingrained behaviour of I can walk my dog here, or this is what I do. I think if we could keep people on the tracks, it would go a long, long way.
Department of Conservation's Graham Taylor says part of the problem is that New Zealand's penguins only produce one chick per season, and we need to do more to protect them.
If we were to lose penguins from the north and elsewhere, we're losing part of that special biological heritage that we've got as a country. It seems sad that we would allow things to go so bad that these things disappear out of the north just because we haven't managed them properly up there.
He says little blue penguins are classified as at risk and urged action is needed to ensure they don't become a threatened species.
Rugby legend Inga the Winger is being fondly remembered as a giant of the game. Vainga Tuigamala has died at the age of 52. He was born in Samoa and played 19 tests for the All Blacks between 1991 and 1993, and later 23 tests for Manu Samoa from 1996. In between, he switched to rugby league and played more than 100 matches for English club Wigan. Sports editor Stephen Hewson has more.
Tuigamala goes. Tuigamala over the 22. Tuigamala all the way. A magnificent score. He got the
Vainga Tuigamala played club rugby for Ponsonby and provincial rugby for Auckland, going on to play his first game for the All Blacks in 1989 before making his Test debut in 1991 against the United States at the 1991 World Cup. Former All Black and Auckland coach Sir John Hart played a large part in Tuigamala's career.
I came into contact with him when he was very young, 18, 19, in New Zealand Colts teams, and he was just, a dynamic player on the field. He was a really nice person, always the same. He was a great giver through his life. He wasn't a taker. He's someone that people would have huge respect for.
Tuigamala had health problems in recent years. He'd been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and was in a promotional video talking about a program he was putting together to help those with obesity.
Unfortunately, I've been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes just recently. I'm obese, as you can see. High blood pressure. I had stroke about 9 years ago. Probably the worst sleep apnea record in the country. So with all that, taking place over the numerous years, I've really just, in rugby terms, dropped the ball.
Tuigamala was one of the first blockbusting wingers in New Zealand in world rugby, and John Hart says not only was he a special person, but a special player.
He had a special career when you look back at his rugby time with the New Zealand All Blacks, going into league with Wigan and then rugby with Newcastle, and particularly coming back and being able to play for the Western Samoa. All round, just a fantastic career.
Tuigamala retired from playing in 2002. In 2008, he was appointed a member of the New Zealand Order of Merit for services to rugby and the community. He's survived by his wife Daphne and 4 children.
Just before we go to the news, an update from the protest in Wellington. The police say they have serious concerns for the children involved in the protest and are urging Wellington protesters to take them home. The police are working with Oranga Tamariki to ensure children are at the forefront of planning and response decisions. And they estimate that there are around 30 children who are currently present at the protest at Parliament grounds.
RNZ News at 6. Good evening, kia ora tātou, ko Evie Ashton tēnei. Ukraine's ambassador to New Zealand is calling for the world to show its condemnation of Russia's invasion of her country by imposing significant and coordinated sanctions. New Zealand says an unthinkable and catastrophic number of innocent lives could be lost and is calling on Russia to permanently withdraw from Ukraine. It has joined other Western countries in imposing travel and export bans against Russia. In an online briefing, Katerina Zelenko appealed for further international support.
History repeats itself. That is what we know from the school books. We cannot let this happen again. Lessons of the past need to be recalled. If the world doesn't stop Russian aggression, the world will suffer.
A Ukrainian woman protesting against Russia's invasion says she's afraid for her friends and family back home. Dozens of people protested outside the Russian embassy in Wellington this afternoon. Lana says her mother almost ended up in hospital after she heard about the conflict, and neither of them slept last night.
I don't think anyone in Ukrainian community had 1 hour of sleep last night. We are constantly in contact with our relatives and friends back there.
Lana says her nephew and brother-in-law are in the front line in Ukraine's army, and that's scary. New Zealand drivers will see effects of the Russia-Ukraine crisis within days, with increases in petrol prices. The country's oil is imported from Asia and the Middle East, but Russia is the second largest exporter in the world. So with the military operation escalating, it's likely oil exports will dwindle, putting the squeeze on the global supply. The general manager of Waitomo Group, Jimmy Ormsby, says the invasion has already caused a hike.
There was around just under 10% increase in crude prices over the last 48 hours, so you could expect that to be reflected in a circa 10 cent a litre price increase at the pumps in the next week or 2 weeks.
The Ukraine invasion has already pushed crude oil prices as high as $105 a barrel. The Education and COVID-19 Response Minister expects COVID will strike nearly every school in the country in the next few weeks. The number of COVID cases in the community jumped by 12,000 today, taking the total number of active cases in the country to 39,500. There have also been 5 more deaths of people with COVID-19. Chris Hipkins told students at Mana College in Porirua today the virus is only going to keep spreading.
We're now up to 1 in 5 schools have COVID-19 cases in them, and that's going to just continue to increase from here. We expect in the next few weeks that just about every school, every early childhood service potentially is going to end up coming into contact with COVID-19 as it spreads more rapidly throughout the community. That is now going to happen.
Chris Hipkins says schools are well prepared with high vaccination rates and good supplies of masks. The National Party says all police officers and defence personnel who lost their jobs over the COVID vaccine mandates should be re-employed. The High Court has ruled the mandates requiring police and defence staff to be double vaccinated or face losing their job as unlawful. Nationals leader Christopher Luxon says the fewer than 300 staff across both organisations who lost their jobs should now be re-employed. He says the ruling also has implications for vaccine mandates more generally, saying the mandates don't make sense in the Omicron era and should be phased out after the peak of the outbreak. Police have serious concerns for the children involved in the anti-mandate protest at Parliament and are urging protesters to take their kids home. They say they're working with Oranga Tamariki to make sure their children are kept safe. They estimate there are around 30 children at the protest. Police are aware of people planning to travel to Wellington to join the protest over the weekend, but they're urging them to stay away from an occupation site because it's no longer a safe environment for families and children. A ship with 18 people on board has crossed the Cook Strait to join the protest at Parliament, including a couple who intend to get married. Greg, who didn't want to give his last name, captained the ship, which docked in Wellington Harbour 6 hours after leaving Picton. He says others have asked him about crossing Cook Strait, and he tells them it's not easy.
Yeah, you got to respect it. There's a lot of tide and weather here can catch you and give you a hell of a hiding. So, treat it with respect.
The anti-COVID mandate protest at Parliament is in its 17th day and has markedly decreased in size since a week ago. Police are warning people to not join the protest this weekend. And the Three Waters National Transition Unit Board will be chaired by Sir Brian Roche. The board will advise on the establishment of 4 new water services organisations as part of the government's Three Waters reform programme. The 4 organisations will each deliver drinking water, wastewater and stormwater services around the country. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, Country Life visits the world's largest worm farm and meets the beef farmer who's diversifying into strawberries, not as a fodder crop, I hope. Music historian and writer Chris Burke selects the mixtape. Tim Finn is the Friday Night Live act. And because the first US $1 bill was printed on this day in 1862, we've got a Sonic Tonic dedicated to paper on Nights with me, Brian Crump, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
You're back with Lisa Owen on Checkpoint next, but first the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Saturday. For Northland to Taranaki, including Coromandel and Taumarunui. Mainly fine, isolated showers for Northland and for Auckland and Coromandel Peninsula tomorrow. For Bay of Plenty, Taupo and Taihape, fine, but some showers are developing tomorrow evening. Gisborne, Hawke's Bay and Wairarapa, cloudy periods with isolated showers, some possibly heavy about the ranges tomorrow. Whanganui to Wellington, mainly fine. Marlborough, Nelson and Bulla, fine today, but cloudy periods tomorrow. Isolated showers about the ranges of Marlborough and Nelson in the afternoons and evenings. Westland and Fiordland, fine at first. Cloud is increasing tonight and rain developing about Fiordland, becoming fine tomorrow afternoon. Canterbury, Otago and Southland, mainly fine today. Scattered rain is developing about Stewart Island tonight and spreading northwards tomorrow morning. Rain easing tomorrow afternoon and becoming fine south of Canterbury. And for Te Kohu, the Chatham Islands, cloudy periods and just a few showers. The time is coming up to 7 minutes past 6. We'll have news headlines for you at 6:30.
Nā mihi iwi, no mai hoki mai. This is Checkpoint, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. Bomb blasts have rung out across the Ukrainian capital Kyiv this morning, where residents have been sheltering in basements or underground train stations. It was a sleepless night for many under the shadow of Russia's advancing troops. Many metro stations have been full of families who've taken sleeping bags, puzzles and their pets. But this resident says none of it feels real.
Well, it just happened. We were not preparing to flee. Nobody believed that this war would start and that they would take Kyiv directly. I think most people are hoping that it'll all be okay. I also hope so.
The Ukrainian authorities say the early morning explosions were their own forces downing enemy aircraft, which crashed into a residential building, setting it alight. They fear Russia aims to surround the capital and topple the government as fighting rages across multiple fronts. Russian forces have captured the Chernobyl former nuclear power plant, which sits between Belarus and Kyiv, sparking this from the White House.
This unlawful and dangerous hostage-taking, which could upend the routine civil service efforts required to maintain and protect the nuclear waste facilities, is obviously incredibly alarming and greatly concerning. We condemn it and we request their release.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky vowed to stay in the capital despite being in grave danger personally.
According to the information we have, the enemy has designated me as target number 1. My family is target number 2. They want to destroy Ukraine politically by destroying the head of state.
Meanwhile, fresh sanctions against Russia are coming thick and fast. The Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison says they will target oligarchs and major Russian banks and companies.
Today, Australia will be beginning imposing further sanctions on oligarchs whose economic weight is of strategic significance to Moscow, and over 300 members of the Russian Duma, their parliament, who voted to authorise the use of Russian troops in Ukraine to illegally invade Ukraine.
The US and other NATO members have sent military aid to Ukraine, but there is no move to send troops for fear of sparking a wider European conflict. Now, the war in Ukraine might be happening thousands of kilometres away, but you may have noticed a direct hit to your KiwiSaver this morning as a result. To explain what's going on, we're joined by ASB Chief Economist Nick Tuffley. Kia ora, Nick.
Hello.
Hey, some people might have got a bit of a shock if they checked in on their KiwiSaver account and noticed that they might have lost a bit overnight. Where's it gone and what's it to do with Russia?
Well, look, we have obviously seen some of the global equity markets take a little bit of a knockback over the last day or so, more so in Europe, which is economically more directly exposed to Russia through its trade relationships and its reliance on Russian gas. Now, one thing that I would point out is we've actually seen a number of the markets during the day here actually sort of lift back up from the weakness that some of them saw yesterday. So, look, there's been a little bit of noise, but I think the key thing people need to remember is, look, we do from day to day see movements in balances, and we've got to remember when it comes to our KiwiSaver balances, we're saving for our retirement, which is decades ahead of us, and there are going to be ups and downs along the way.
So, in short, don't panic in the short term.
No, look, don't panic is always one of the best ways to make investment decisions. It's those times when you're being driven by fear and greed is when some of your decisions may not be the best. Perhaps it's worth looking back a couple of years ago when we had the pandemic hit and we had all that fear and concern about what it would mean for the global economy. And we saw equity markets fall by up to a third. And now look where they are now, they're much, much higher. So I think the key thing is look, we may see a bit of volatility in markets going ahead depending on developments in Ukraine and how long any conflict lasts, how heated it gets between the West and Russia. But look, we've just got to bear in mind that it's always hard to pick the bottom of markets and the tops of markets, and sometimes we just need to think about that long-term perspective, cross our fingers and buckle in for the ride.
OK, the other thing that people will be watching is prices at the pump, petrol. And the Energy Minister, Megan Woods, put out a statement today, and she said this: Russia's invasion of the Ukraine and any resulting curtailment of Russian oil supply won't affect New Zealand's fuel supply. Is that right?
Well, in some ways it is, from the point of view that the vast majority of where we get our crude oil from is sourced from the Middle East, and we get a lot of our refined product out of Asia. So yes, in that sense, but where we have in reality over the last month seen some impacts is not so much on the availability of supply, but the cost. Russia is one of the world's biggest oil producers and a big exporter. So if you see a reduction in Russian exports to the world overall, we are likely to get ongoing high oil prices. So that's where it matters for us at the petrol pump.
So how long before it hits us then at the service station?
Well, look, as people have probably noticed, the price has been creeping up over the last month, and part of it is because we've already seen oil prices lifting as the oil markets have priced in the sort of growing threat that's coming through. In New Zealand, we do have essentially the oil companies running what they call sort of price to market, where they're generally reflecting fairly quickly in the price at the pump what it's going to cost them to replace that fuel, whether it's oil prices going up and down or the exchange rate going up and down. So look, brace yourself, because the impacts tend to come through relatively quickly.
The other thing today, obviously, sanctions announced worldwide, really. Some of the big players freezing financial assets of Russia and Russian companies. New Zealand, well, Russia's a bit of a trifling trade partner for us. We're going to see much impact on markets as a result of this?
Well, for us, our direct exposure to Russian trade is, it's about a few $100 million worth of exports, and a lot of that is dairy. Let's put in context, we're exporting well over $10 billion worth of dairy products. So we're not going to see those sort of direct impacts there. It's the issues like what it does to import costs of fuel, as we've talked about, what it does to, say, wheat costs. On the flip side, we export dairy and meat, and some of our key competitors in places like the EU and US use grain to feed a lot of their livestock. And one of the impacts we are seeing is two grain bowls, which is the Ukraine, one being invaded, and two, the other having sanctions put against it. So we may well find that some of our competitors find it's more expensive to produce their dairy and meat, whereas for us, we're not really going to be affected because we're relying on grass, which is sunshine and water.
Thank you for your time this evening. That's Nick Tuffley, who's the Chief Economist at ASB. Now, let's head to a quick traffic update now. A crash is blocking southbound lanes on the southern motorway out of Auckland near Mill Road. Go carefully, and they're warning to expect delays if you are heading that way. It is 6:15 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Audible bomb blasts interrupted an interview with New Zealand's honorary consul to Ukraine earlier today. Mark Wright, who has been the go-to person for New Zealanders in Ukraine for about 9 years, was describing the tense atmosphere in Kyiv.
You think things are quite normal on the street, and then suddenly you'll hear these deep boom, like one just went off. Oh God, one just went off then. That was much closer. And so, these are the things that kind of really set you on edge.
While bomb blasts reverberate in the background, Mark Wright says the bombardment started around 6 o'clock in the morning on the outskirts of Kyiv and had continued sporadically throughout the day.
The type of shelling that's going on seems to be targeted at the strategic areas. We haven't lost any communications or power yet, thank goodness, but that's obviously a point which will, I would think, be targeted in due course.
Mr. Wright says the thuds from the bombs are coming from all points of the compass. He describes an eerie atmosphere in the capital, which is home to nearly 3 million people.
In the morning, of course, there was a lot of I wouldn't say panic, but a lot of people getting themselves in a situation where they had options. So getting fuel, getting cash, and I guess it symbolises the fact that most people never thought this would happen. I think I would be like a lot of the expats here. We had been considering what might happen, and we've been keeping our cars full of fuel. We have a bag packed and some essentials with us, and ready to move as it necessitates.
Countless Ukrainians are fleeing the violence. Tens of thousands are crossing into neighbouring countries like Poland and Moldova. Many more are seeking safety within Ukraine. Metro stations have been turned into temporary bomb shelters. CNN's Clarissa Ward filed this report from one of those shelters.
Kyiv residents scramble to find shelter as Russia's brutal assault unfolds. Deep underground, scenes reminiscent of the Second World War, the shock just sinking in that what was unimaginable is now reality. As 36-year-old Daria tells us.
You wake up in a totally new reality at 5 a.m. and you find out that the world is no longer the safe place you imagined. We are an independent country, Ukraine, and we are totally not same as Russians. And we don't want to be a part of Russia or any other country. It's really getting very emotional. And I cannot believe it's happening, really.
Yesterday, this was just an ordinary metro station full of people going to and from work. Today, it has become a de facto bomb shelter, and there are just hundreds and hundreds of people who have descended on this place, fearful for their lives and uncertain of what the future will bring. And the thing you hear over and over again from people is, where can we go? Where is it safe now to go in Ukraine? And I want to be clear about something. This is not a frontline city in Ukraine's 8-year war with Russia. This is a thriving metropolis of 1.4 million people who have never experienced anything like this in their entire lives. And now they're being forced to literally camp out with their families, their pets, their loved ones. They grabbed whatever they could from their homes and they brought it here. And they don't know what's next for them. They don't know what the new Ukraine will look like and what place they will have in it.
Many we approach are too overcome to speak.
I'm asking them if they're afraid. They're very nervous. Why are you?
Look at the situation around you, this woman says.
Это очень страшно, это ужасно. I'm so sorry. It's a terrible, terrible situation.
There's no doubt here about who is responsible for this conflict, but few can understand why.
So it's interesting. I just asked them, what do they think of President Putin? Do they think he's crazy? They said he's not crazy. He's sick. He's sick. We just want to live peacefully.
I just hope that some people in Russia may see this and just stand against the Putin and the war.
A simple plea for mercy that has so far fallen on deaf ears.
4 years ago, Christchurch City Council vowed to get tough on the owners of 30 central city buildings left derelict since the 2011 earthquake. A wander through central Christchurch shows many of the buildings, nicknamed the Dirty 30, still look unchanged. There are boarded up windows, tarps covering gaping holes and containers keeping bricks from falling on passers-by. But council say progress is finally being made on most. Rachel Graham has more.
It's still a city of ruins on some streets of central Christchurch, with decrepit buildings abandoned since the quakes. Council calls them barrier sites, a barrier to the regeneration of the city. 3 of the Dirty 30 remain unrepaired eyesores. The old Hunters and Collectors building in High Street has had good progress, though plastic sheeting still covers the front, old advertising flapping in the wind. But inside, a team of builders are hard at work. New owners, QB Studio Limited, have plans to turn it into a flexible workspace. One of its directors, Michael Fisher, says work is well on the way.
A lot of the demolitions started, so the rear facade and the front, that's all gone now, and all the internal demolitions underway. The front facade will be the next thing, just waiting for the consent to be approved, and we'll be into it. So I think, over the course of the next 2 to 3 months, subject to that council processing time, you'll see some real change.
Some of the buildings on the barrier site list have the added complication of being heritage sites. There's the Laurie and Wilson Auctioneers building and the Odeon Theatre. Both are still shielded by a tall stack of containers. a clear sign they're not considered safe yet. Canterbury Regional Council bought the buildings in 2020. Director of Finance and Corporate Services, Giles Southwell, says there's been some progress.
With the Laurie and Wilson building, that's a Category 2 building, and we are currently strengthening that to 100% of code and also refurbishing it, and that work will be completed by the middle of this year, and that will be office accommodation that we will make a decision on the use of. The Odeon Theatre is a Category 1 building, so more important and of more heritage value. There's less of the building in existence, it's mostly just a frontage. We've yet to make a decision about how we will approach that work.
Around the corner is another place barricaded with containers, Dave Henderson's Sargood building on Litchfield Street. Mr Henderson says he's still working on options, but the big issue is the lack of progress on nearby revitalisation projects. The former Two Fat Indians restaurant on Manchester Street is a site that's seen no progress in the last 4 years. But property manager Ernest Duval says calling it a barrier site is naive and unhelpful.
It's shock tactics of trying to shame property owners into doing something about their building when they may, for a variety of reasons, not be capable of doing anything. The costs associated with upgrading or renovating or redeveloping a site may be prohibitive. You know, they may not be able to get long-term tenants. They may not be able to get funding. So I think a more conciliatory approach should be adopted.
Mr Duval says if there's too much pressure, owners may be pushed into demolition when a building could be saved. Despite the threat of enforcement action against stubborn property owners, the council has only taken action against one. Council case manager Andrew Wheely says assisting owners is more effective than threatening them. 16 properties are deemed as having a commitment to action. Mr Wheely says that often means a building consent has been lodged.
A building consent is very good. And we know that if they've enacted a building consent or they've got a building consent, we know that there's going to be activity on the site, and a lot of them, there is activity going on in the background. Like our city just up the road here, that's got a big white cloth over top of it. You can't see what's going on underneath there, but I can assure you that they're busy strengthening that building.
He's confident that by the end of this year, the Dirty 30 will be on their way to rejuvenation.
And if you were listening to that story on radio, do check out the video. It'll be on our webpage. A group of 18 people have sailed across the Crook Strait to take part in the protest at Parliament. Among them is a couple who intend to get married at the occupation, which is now in its 17th day. They were captained by a man named Greg, who brought them across in his 17-metre vessel, the Seddon Park. Shortly after docking in Wellington Harbour this afternoon, he told our reporter, Jake McKee, people have been asking about sailing across, but it's harder than it might seem.
It is, yeah, you've got to respect it. There's a lot of tide and weather here can catch you and give you a hell of a hiding. So, yeah, treat it with respect, and it's lovely on a nice day, but yeah, even the passengers that were with me, you know, you could see the tide out there today, you know, the effects of the tide.
And can you tell me a little bit about who was on board it? I understand it was about 18 people?
Yeah, just a bunch of mates from the camp in Picton. They rounded up, wanted to come over, and some guys I knew online from down south come up. They drove all night, mate, from pretty much Bluff, I think.
So, like, essentially drove up Thursday, got to Picton, and you took them across?
They were working yesterday morning, jumped in the car, a group of them must take turns, and drove all night to meet us in time to sail this morning from Picton. Because they had to sail when we did, or the tide would be turning, and catch the uplift on the tide over, and yeah, it works good. So
how long did it take to get across? Like, what time did you leave?
We were scheduled to leave at 6:30, and then we had a couple missing. The young couple who were getting married, I think. And managed to track them down. It was 7:15 we got away, so it was within time. We made real good time across.
So about a 5-hour-ish
voyage? 5, 6 hours.
Okay. And so the wedding, so that's what I'd heard. So a couple have come across to get married at the protest?
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, and I just sort of met them last night in Picton when we turned up there.
And police are telling people not to join the protest this weekend and say they'll maintain a presence in the area. The size of the protest has decreased over the week, with about 300 vehicles inside the blockade compared to 800 last week. Now, finally tonight, if you needed it, here's another reason to get the house looking good this weekend. It could help lower your risk of heart disease. A new study in the Journal of the American Heart Association says small daily movements can have a big impact. CNN's Mary Maloney explains.
Want to boost your heart health? Running marathons or doing intense workouts aren't the only way. Simple household chores may be all you need. Steve Nguyen is the lead author of a new study published in the Journal of the American Heart Association. A team of researchers at UC San Diego measured the physical activity of more than 5,000 American women between the ages of 63 and 97. And discovered doing chores like washing dishes, vacuuming, and cooking lowered their heart disease risk.
Any housework that we do, working in the kitchen, gardening, sort of all sorts of daily living activities.
This study found women who spent engaged in what they call daily life movement for at least 4 hours had a 43% lower risk of developing either cardiovascular disease or coronary heart disease, which includes heart attacks. They also had a 30% lower risk of stroke and a 62% lower risk of dying from cardiovascular disease. Researchers say the study could change how healthcare providers and caregivers discuss physical activity with patients.
Our hearts and cardiovascular systems do not particularly distinguish whether we're getting our movement through walking or running or through daily life movement.
Researchers say people of all ages could see a similar benefit.
We have no reason to think that there would not be benefit. We would just like to replicate our findings.
I can think of 1,000 reasons not to do the housework. Some of your feedback on unvaccinated kids playing sport. Mixed bag here. Gail says, I couldn't believe my ears. So being allowed to have a few games of cricket or rugby is more important than being vaccinated. COVID will spread faster than a fast bowler's delivery, says Gail. Another listener reckons unvaccinated children should definitely be allowed to participate in after-school sports and activities. Shame on us that we already discriminate against unvaccinated New Zealanders that want to work, let alone discriminate against children as well. And this listener says, does it really matter if unvaccinated kids mix with vaccinated during sports? Case numbers are exploding in schools. It's a given your kids will get COVID. But Simon says, I don't support unvaccinated kids in sports activities. This is still a severe disease for some kids. And what if they infect parents or grandparents? On the subject of Ukraine, this piece of feedback, if China wants to be an upstanding member of the international community, it too needs to place sanctions on Russia. Probably very unlikely, they say. And another person says Putin going to war is abominable, but of course he's not the only president to invade another country, kill civilians in the name of collateral, and not just one country, but numerous, and they've all got away with it, says that listener. That's about all we've got time for. Don't forget the late news team will keep you updated throughout the night and over the weekend. Our news teams will be on the war in Ukraine. If you've missed anything from the show, you can find Checkpoint on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to check out our videos and stories online. Have a fantastic weekend.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Kia ora tātou, I'm Evie Ashton. Ukraine's ambassador to New Zealand is calling for the world to show its condemnation of Russia's invasion of her country by imposing significant and coordinated sanctions. Drivers will see effects of the Russia-Ukraine crisis within days at the petrol pump. The Education Minister expects COVID will strike nearly every school in the country in the next few weeks. And police have serious concerns for the children in the anti-mandate protest at Parliament and are urging protesters to take their children home. Those are the headlines. Our next news and weather is at 7 o'clock.
Most of the